Evan Hale had spent 6 months preparing for the interview that could rescue his career. But on his way to Hawthorne Dynamics, he pulled over to help a woman stranded in the heavy rain, arrived late, and was treated like a man who could not manage his own responsibilities. Inside the interview room, Victoria Ashbourne looked at him with clear contempt and called him a single father who did not know how to keep his priorities in order. Evan believed the opportunity was already lost. Then the door opened. The woman he had helped on the roadside walked inside, removed her coat, took the seat at the head of the table, and said one sentence that changed everything. "Continue," she said. "I want to hear how he answers." If you enjoy stories where kindness is overlooked and later returns to change everything, subscribe and stay until the end. At 6:20 that morning, Evan was already awake, going through his notes for the third time. He had been unemployed for nearly 4 months, ever since the logistics company where he had worked for 9 years reorganized its operations division and eliminated his position along with dozens of others. The interview at Hawthorne Dynamics was not just another opportunity. As far as Evan could see, it was the first real chance he had found in months to put his career back on the path he had spent his entire adult life building. For weeks, he had studied the company, reading quarterly reports, distribution summaries, and public statements from the executive team, until he understood the structure of their business better than many people who worked there. He had even prepared a rough proposal addressing an operational weakness he suspected the company was quietly dealing with, although he had no way to confirm it until he entered the room. He put on the same charcoal suit he had worn to his previous 3 interviews, carefully pressed and brushed the night before because it was the only one that still fit the way he wanted. Before leaving the apartment, he checked the schedule for picking up his son that evening, sent a brief message to the babysitter, then put away his phone and planned not to check it again until the interview was finished. He had given himself 45 extra minutes for travel, more time than he thought he could possibly need, because he had promised himself there would be no excuses that day, no matter what happened. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it always was before sunrise, before his son woke up asking for cereal, a missing shoe, or help finding a permission slip that had been sitting on the counter for days. Evan had built his entire routine around protecting mornings like this, especially the ones that truly mattered. And during 4 months of job searching, he had learned exactly how fragile that protection could be. One delayed bus, one missed alarm, or one unexpected call from school could throw an entire day's plan apart before it even began. He had experienced enough mornings like that to understand the difference between an excuse and a real emergency, and he had promised himself long ago that he would never allow the two to become confused in front of an employer. It was a quiet kind of discipline that no line on a resume could ever explain. The discipline of creating backup plans in a life that left very little room for mistakes. He briefly thought about the version of himself who had walked into interviews 5 years earlier, before the layoffs, before the long series of rejection emails and unanswered applications, before he understood what it felt like to explain an employment gap to a stranger holding his resume. That version of Evan had never worried about arriving early enough to prove he deserved a place in the room. He had simply felt that he belonged there. Now, every interview carried the quiet pressure of something to prove, and Evan had almost become accustomed to entering the room already feeling several steps behind. He was always prepared for questions about the gap, already rehearsing answers that sounded confident without appearing defensive. It was exhausting in a way that rarely appeared on his face, and Evan had become very skilled at keeping it hidden. Evan believed he had removed every possible reason for being late. He had mapped the route the night before, considered the traffic patterns near the financial district, and left with enough extra time to manage almost any delay a normal morning could bring. But about 20 minutes before his scheduled interview, while driving along a service road made slippery by the rain, he noticed a gray sedan pulled close to the curb, its hazard lights blinking faintly through the downpour. A woman stood beside it, crouched near the front wheel, struggling to loosen a jack while cars rushed past close enough to splash water across her coat. Evan slowed down before he had even fully decided to stop. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, calculated the remaining time in his head, and understood exactly what stopping could cost him. For a moment, Evan sat with both hands on the steering wheel, watching her through the rearview mirror. He was already short on time. Stopping meant putting at risk everything he had spent 6 months working toward, every rehearsed answer, every carefully prepared detail, and every ounce of effort that had gone into one narrow opportunity. But he also knew what it felt like to stand beside a busy road while people drove past and pretended not to see. Because more than once in his own life, Evan had been on the other side of that exact moment. Back when Evan's car had broken down outside a grocery store with his son strapped into the back seat, no one had stopped for nearly 20 minutes. He remembered exactly how that had felt. So he pulled over anyway. The woman was Claire Whitmore, although Evan had no idea who she was and no reason to ask. Her tire had blown after she drove over a piece of metal debris near the curb, and the spare in her trunk was underinflated, making the jack unstable on the rain-soaked pavement. Her phone battery was almost dead, and the roadside service she had called gave her a wait time long enough to ruin the entire morning. Evan offered to help before she even asked. He knelt beside the wheel in his carefully pressed suit, ignoring the rain soaking through the fabric, and began loosening the lug nuts with the small emergency kit he kept in his own trunk for situations like this. Up close, Claire looked less like someone dealing with an ordinary inconvenience and more like someone who rarely had time for unexpected problems. Still, nothing about her behavior suggested she expected special treatment. She thanked him twice before he had even finished opening his trunk, apologizing for interrupting his morning as though asking a stranger for help was somehow an unreasonable burden. Evan brushed aside the apology and crouched beside the flat tire, checking the position of the jack before touching anything. It was the same careful habit he had developed while handling equipment throughout 20 years of operations work. Claire watched him for a moment, noticing the suit, the tie, and the way he moved like a man who clearly had somewhere important to be. "Are you heading to work?" she asked. Evan told her he had an important appointment. Claire immediately told him he should leave. She said she could handle it herself and did not want him ruining his morning for a stranger standing beside the road. But Evan looked at the unstable jack, the slippery pavement, and the rain that was only becoming heavier. He stayed anyway. There was nothing dramatic about the decision, no speech, no attempt to impress anyone. Just a man who knew how to change a tire and did not feel comfortable leaving someone to struggle alone in weather like that. Claire looked at him and asked why he was willing to risk being late for something that obviously mattered to him. Evan answered simply. "An interview can be explained," he said. "A bad decision is much harder to fix." He did not mention the company. Claire did not ask what he did for a living. And in the strange privacy of that roadside encounter, neither of them learned much about the other beyond a first name and the particular way each person handled pressure. It took about 12 minutes to finish the job. Evan replaced the damaged tire, secured the spare, lowered the jack, and checked everything carefully to make sure it was properly in place. When he finished, Claire asked for his number so she could thank him properly later, maybe send something, maybe find a practical way to return the favor. Evan politely declined. He told her she did not owe him anything and climbed back into his car before the conversation could continue. Then he checked the time. His expression changed immediately. He called the recruiting line at Hawthorne Dynamics and explained as calmly as possible that he had encountered an unexpected situation on the road. He said he was already on his way and asked them to please keep his interview slot open for a few more minutes. No one answered. Instead, Evan left a voicemail, keeping his voice steady despite the pressure tightening in his chest. Then he pulled back into traffic, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Evan arrived at the Hawthorne Dynamics building 11 minutes after his scheduled interview time. He crossed the lobby almost running, his shoes making quick sounds against the polished floor. What he did not know was that the woman he had just helped on the roadside was heading toward the very same building, only a few minutes behind him. At the front desk, the receptionist glanced at the clock and then at her screen. Evan's appointment window had technically ended. Evan calmly explained what had happened and mentioned that he had called ahead. But before the receptionist could respond, Victoria Ashbourne walked across the lobby with her assistant following close behind. She immediately recognized Evan as the final candidate scheduled that morning. Instead of asking what had delayed him, Victoria checked her watch and spoke before he could finish explaining. "A candidate for a director position who cannot manage his own schedule," she said, glancing toward her assistant as if the comment was meant to be heard by more than just Evan. Evan apologized without giving every detail of the morning, choosing a brief explanation instead. Victoria looked at him and spoke plainly. "At this level of the company, we do not hire explanations." She opened the folder her assistant handed her and reviewed his resume. Her eyes paused at the gap in his employment history, along with a note from Human Resources mentioning a previous request for flexible scheduling because of family responsibilities. Then she asked, almost casually, whether he was still a single father. Evan confirmed it without adding anything more. Victoria gave a small, controlled smile. "That must already make your schedule complicated," she said, "which makes this particular morning even more concerning." It was a quiet remark, delivered almost casually. But it did exactly what she intended it to do. It turned the fact that Evan was raising his child alone into evidence against his ability, turning his personal circumstances into a question about his professional judgment before he had even taken a seat. Almost as an afterthought, Victoria mentioned that the candidate before him had arrived 25 minutes early. She described it as executive discipline, the kind of standard Hawthorne Dynamics expected from someone being considered for a director position. Evan did not argue or raise his voice. He simply asked for 10 minutes in the room and told her he would let his work speak for itself. Victoria looked prepared to cancel the interview entirely. But Nolan Briggs, the chief financial officer standing nearby, pointed out that Evan had made the effort to get there and that the process deserved to continue. Victoria agreed reluctantly and motioned toward the conference room down the hallway. Evan entered the room already feeling as if the decision had been made before a single question had been asked. He took the chair offered to him, placed his folder carefully on the table, and reminded himself of something his former operations director used to say during the most difficult weeks of a supply chain crisis. "Control what you can control." He could not change the traffic, the rain, the stranded car, or the opinion already forming in Victoria Ashbourne's mind before he had spoken a single word about his qualifications. What he could control was the way he answered the next hour of questions. So Evan quietly decided that his answers would do whatever convincing needed to be done. It was not exactly confidence. It was closer to the calm that comes when there is very little left to lose, and you decide to spend what remains on doing the work properly instead of trying to prove yourself. The interview that followed seemed almost designed, intentionally or not, to make Evan stumble. Victoria repeatedly guided the conversation in favor of the other finalist, a younger candidate named Grant Sterling, whose polished resume and family connections had clearly opened opportunities that Evan had never received. Grant had been asked about growth strategy, leadership philosophy, and his vision for the company 5 years into the future. They were questions designed to highlight confidence and impressive language rather than practical substance. But when it was Evan's turn, the questions changed completely. Victoria asked whether he could work late nights with little notice. She asked who would come first if his son needed him during an important deadline. She questioned whether the gap in his employment history had weakened his professional instincts. And more than once, she asked why Hawthorne should choose someone trying to return to the workforce, instead of someone already performing at the highest level of his career. At one point, Victoria asked directly whether a single father could realistically be flexible enough for a leadership position at that level. Evan answered without hesitation. Someone who has learned to manage real responsibility is often more flexible, not less, he said, because he has already spent years solving problems that cannot wait for a convenient moment. Victoria did not appear satisfied with the answer. She quickly moved on, as if his response had not supported the conclusion she had already reached. Victoria had spent most of her career surrounded by a particular kind of person. The kind who arrived at meetings with assistants carrying their bags. The kind whose family names opened doors before a single achievement appeared on a resume. The kind who never had to explain a gap in employment because they had always been protected from one. Victoria herself had followed a similar path, moving from a respected university into a family friend's company, and later into Hawthorne Dynamics through a recommendation rather than an open competitive search. Over time, she had built her understanding of leadership around presentation, credentials, and the confidence that came from never having to fight for an opportunity. And she genuinely believed that ease was a qualification of its own. A man like Evan, whose resume showed the marks of genuine struggle rather than a smooth and uninterrupted rise, did not fit the image she had spent 20 years building of what an executive should look like. It was not entirely personal, although it certainly felt personal to Evan as he sat across from her. It was simply a way of thinking so deeply rooted that Victoria rarely noticed when she was applying it. Eventually, Nolan shifted the conversation toward something more practical. He presented a case study involving one of Hawthorne's regional distribution centers, which had been struggling with delayed shipments, increasing overtime costs, and a major client threatening to end a long-standing contract. Grant had already suggested hiring additional employees and investing in a new software platform. It sounded impressive, but the solution would require months to implement and a significant budget. Evan studied the numbers Nolan handed him and noticed something different almost immediately. The real issue was not a shortage of workers. It was a conflict in the truck scheduling system and a poorly managed shift handoff process that left employees idle during slow periods and overwhelmed when demand suddenly increased. He identified 3 specific time periods where the bottlenecks were happening. He pointed out that staffing during the slower windows was actually more than necessary, and calculated that the approval process for outbound shipments was creating an average delay of 47 minutes per load. Nolan leaned forward, clearly interested for the first time that morning. Victoria immediately interrupted, insisting that Hawthorne did not need a supervisor's solution for a director-level position. Evan calmly replied that a director should never be so disconnected from daily operations that he could not recognize where the company was losing money right in front of him. He walked Nolan through his reasoning step by step, sketching a simple diagram on the back of the case study printout. It showed how the shift handoff was creating a 15-minute dead period twice a day, leaving drivers waiting for paperwork that could easily have been prepared beforehand. Evan explained that the software Grant had suggested might eventually be useful, but it would take months to put in place and would not solve the scheduling conflict underneath it. The problem was rooted in routines and approval procedures, not a lack of digital tools. Nalin asked several follow-up questions, this time more directly testing whether Evan's solution could withstand scrutiny. Evan answered every question without hesitation, drawing from years of experience, watching similar problems develop on warehouse floors he had personally managed. Victoria sat with her arms crossed, her earlier confidence fading as the discussion moved away from polished resumes and toward actual results. When Nalin asked how much funding Evan's approach would require, Evan explained that the first 30 days would cost almost nothing beyond redesigning the schedule and closely tracking the handoff periods. For a moment, Victoria seemed to lose her advantage. She returned to the one issue she still believed she could use against him. With a pointed tone, she asked whether they were really expected to trust someone who could not even arrive on time. Evan paused. He considered explaining everything: the rain, the stranded car, and the woman who had twice told him he did not need to stay. Before he could answer, the conference room door opened. Claire Whitmore walked in. Her hair was dry now, her rain-soaked coat replaced by a tailored blazer, and she carried herself with a completely different presence from the woman Evan had knelt beside on the roadside less than an hour earlier. Everyone in the room stood almost automatically. Victoria's expression shifted with surprise. "We weren't expecting you to join this round," she said. Evan looked at the woman standing in the doorway, then at the empty chair at the head of the table. Slowly, everything began to make sense. Victoria made the introduction, though some of the confidence had disappeared from her voice. "Evan Hale, this is Claire Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Hawthorne Dynamics." Claire looked directly at Evan. "We've already met." The room became completely silent. Victoria's composure slipped for a moment before she quickly tried to recover. "If you two have already crossed paths," she said, "perhaps that explains his lateness after all." Claire turned toward her and calmly pointed out that only minutes earlier, Victoria had insisted the reason for his lateness did not matter. It was the first major reversal of the morning, and it landed heavily. Claire walked across the room and took the seat at the head of the table, placing a slim folder in front of her. For several seconds, nobody said a word. Evan looked at her face, searching for the woman he had helped in the rain less than an hour earlier. He found her there. The same person, now carrying a completely different level of authority, with the quiet composure of someone who knew how to control a room without raising her voice. She did not smile at Evan in a way that suggested favoritism, nor did she avoid his eyes. Instead, she looked at him the way she would look at any candidate she was meeting professionally. In its own way, that was more respectful than anything Victoria had shown him that morning. Claire did not walk in and offer Evan the position simply because he had helped her. That restraint mattered. She made it clear to everyone that she knew nothing about Evan's professional performance. She only knew why he had been late. Because of that, she wanted the rest of the interview judged fairly, without bias working against him or sympathy working in his favor. That kept Evan's position clear. He was not being carried by the CEO's approval. He was simply being given a fair opportunity to prove himself. Still unsettled by the shift in control, Victoria changed her approach. She acknowledged that kindness was admirable, but reminded everyone that they were choosing someone to oversee hundreds of millions of dollars in operations, not giving an award for good character. Claire's response was short and firm. Continue the interview. Victoria pushed ahead with an even more difficult scenario, clearly hoping to uncover a weakness that would settle the question once and for all. But Evan handled the new challenge with the same calm clarity he had shown during the distribution case, explaining his reasoning out loud so everyone in the room could follow his logic. It turned out that the exact bottleneck Evan had identified only minutes earlier was a problem the executive team had been quietly discussing for nearly 3 weeks without finding a solution. Claire recognized the pattern the moment Evan explained it, and something in her posture changed. The polite formality she had shown as a stranger gave way to genuine, focused attention. She asked him how long it had taken him to identify the problem. Evan answered honestly that it had taken about 7 minutes, working only from the numbers Nolan had handed him without any preparation. Nolan did not try to hide his surprise. Victoria, meanwhile, began to realize that the man she had spent the last half hour trying to dismiss was no longer someone she could simply brush aside. She had built her career on reading a room quickly, and what she saw now was not welcome. Grant's presentation from earlier that morning had been polished and carefully rehearsed, filled with the kind of language executives like to hear. But it had not produced a single useful insight that the leadership team did not already know. Evan, on the other hand, had arrived late and soaked from the rain, without a slide presentation or rehearsed introduction. Yet within 7 minutes, he had identified something a highly paid strategy team had been examining for weeks without solving. Victoria could feel the balance in the room shifting away from the version of events she had spent the morning trying to create. And she did not yet know how to turn it back. The interview did not end with an immediate job offer. That would have made everything too simple, and Hawthorne Dynamics did not operate that way. Shortly after the case study discussion ended, Claire had to leave for a board meeting. Once she was gone, Victoria asked Evan to remain behind for a moment in the hallway. She kept her voice low and almost pleasant, which somehow made the words underneath sound even sharper. She told him not to misunderstand what had just happened in that room. Helping the chief executive on the side of the road, she said, does not make you an executive yourself. Evan calmly told her that he had never believed it did. Victoria continued anyway. She explained that the people on that floor had spent years building the relationships and reputations that had earned them their positions. And according to her, no one simply walked in because they happened to meet the right person standing in the rain. It was a quiet and deliberate kind of cruelty, delivered without raising her voice. And it made perfectly clear how Victoria viewed the world she had built her career inside. Evan left the building that afternoon, replaying the conversation in his mind. Not because it hurt him in the way Victoria probably intended, but because it confirmed something he had already begun to suspect about how Hawthorne Dynamics worked beneath its polished exterior. There appeared to be two different versions of the company. One was built around results and practical ability, the version Claire seemed to believe in. The other was built around comfort, connections, and protecting the people who already belonged, the version Victoria had spent 2 decades defending. Evan did not know which version would eventually decide his future. And there was nothing useful to gain by guessing. That evening, he picked up his son and listened to a long, wandering story about a science project involving baking soda and vinegar. He did not mention the interview at all. 2 days later, Evan received an email informing him that Hawthorne Dynamics had decided to move forward with another candidate. Grant Sterling had been given the position. Evan was disappointed, but he did not contact Claire. He did not remind her that he had helped her. He did not try to use that rainy morning on the roadside as an advantage for a job he had not earned through his own qualifications. Instead, he sent a short and respectful note thanking the hearing committee for their time. Then, at least outwardly, he closed the door on the matter. That restraint, more than anything Evan had said during the interview, was what eventually caught Claire's attention. Victoria believed she had won cleanly. Behind the scenes, however, she had quietly influenced the scoring that determined the final outcome. She lowered Evan's leadership rating, increased a category labeled availability risk, and treated his responsibilities as a single parent as a legitimate reason to question his long-term commitment to the position. Weeks later, while reviewing a routine hearing summary as part of an unrelated audit, Claire came across a single line that made her stop. It stated that the candidate showed limited executive availability because of single-parent responsibilities. Claire asked Human Resources who had written it. No one in the room seemed eager to answer. When she reviewed the approval record, the final signature belonged to Victoria Ashbourne. Claire did not react impulsively or reverse the decision based only on emotion. A decision driven purely by sympathy would not have held up against the very culture she was trying to change. Instead, she created a genuine test based on the company's actual business. Hawthorne Dynamics had a major client, Redwood Freight Systems, threatening to cancel a contract worth tens of millions of dollars because of continuing delivery failures at one of the company's regional hubs. Claire asked both Grant and Evan to prepare separate proposals and present them during a formal review with the client present. Victoria objected immediately, pointing out that Evan had already been rejected for the position. Claire calmly told her that, if that were true, then she had nothing to worry about. Evan was surprised when he was contacted again. He asked Claire directly whether the invitation had anything to do with what happened on the roadside that morning. Claire told him clearly that it did not. She explained that she was bringing him back because the 7-minute analysis he had produced under pressure, using unfamiliar numbers, had been stronger than a report the company had paid consultants 6 weeks to prepare. Evan agreed to participate. Grant arrived with a polished slide presentation filled with consulting terminology. He proposed a major investment in new software and a 6-month implementation plan that promised broad improvements further down the line. Evan brought something much simpler: a hand-drawn map of the shipment process, 3 specific changes to the existing schedule, a basic dashboard for tracking results in real time, a 21-day trial period, and a clear plan for reviewing the changes if they failed. The representative from Redwood Freight leaned toward Evan's proposal almost immediately. His plan offered something they could measure within weeks instead of something they would have to wait 6 months to evaluate. Victoria made one final attempt to influence the room. She acknowledged that Evan clearly had a strong operational mind, but argued that the position required what she called executive presence. The Redwood representative looked at her and asked, with little patience remaining, whether executive presence would get his containers out of the warehouse on schedule. The silence that followed said more than any argument could. And for the first time since Evan had entered that building weeks earlier, the direction of the conversation changed permanently. Claire approved a trial of Evan's plan at the struggling distribution center. She brought him in as a consultant for 30 days before making any decision about the permanent position. Victoria remained convinced that the plan would fail once it faced real-world pressure. But over the following 3 weeks, the results began to speak for themselves. Wait times at the facility dropped sharply. Overtime costs decreased in line with Evan's projections. And on-time delivery rates improved enough that Redwood Freight quietly withdrew its threat to cancel the contract. There was nothing dramatic or exaggerated about the outcome. The numbers were simply strong enough to prove that Evan had been right from the moment he first studied the data. When the results were later presented to the executive committee, Victoria described the improvements as a cross-functional effort led by her own division. She barely mentioned Evan's name. Evan sat near the back of the room and said nothing. He was not interested in fighting for recognition in front of people he barely knew. Claire, reviewing the presentation, asked a simple question. She wanted to know who had actually created the new scheduling model. Victoria hesitated. She gave a vague answer about collaboration between several teams. Nalan quietly opened the original proposal on his laptop and turned the screen toward the room. The name at the top was clear. Evan Hale. Claire asked the question again, this time more directly. Victoria had nowhere left to avoid the answer. In front of the entire committee, she admitted that the plan had come from Evan. Claire turned toward him. The person who created the plan, she said, should be the one presenting the results. Evan stood from his seat. And for the first time, Victoria was forced to sit quietly and listen while the man she had once dismissed as someone who did not belong on that floor explained exactly how he had solved a problem that had been costing the company money for months. But the final change in the story was not only about Evan earning the position. It was also about what happened when Victoria's own methods were finally examined. After the issue with the hearing summary came to light, Nalan and Human Resources launched a closer review of the recent hearing process. What they discovered was not one obvious act of wrongdoing. It was a pattern that had been operating quietly for some time. Grant, it turned out, had previous business connections to the Ashbourne family that had never been properly disclosed. Evan's interview scores had been lowered afterward, without any documented reason. His responsibilities as a parent had been used as a factor in an evaluation category where they had no legitimate place. And when the review went further back, they discovered that at least 2 other candidates during the previous year had been rejected using similarly vague and subjective standards connected to the same office. Nalan, who had watched the entire situation develop from the finance side of the table, later admitted to Claire that something had felt wrong during Evan's original interview. But at the time, he had not trusted his own instincts enough to speak up. Like many people inside large organizations, he had assumed that someone with greater seniority and a longer history at the company must have had a valid reason for making those decisions. Even when those decisions had felt uncomfortable to witness. It was a small admission, but it mattered because it showed how easily an entire system could bend around one person's quiet and persistent bias when everyone else assumed that someone would eventually challenge it. Victoria defended herself by insisting that she had simply been protecting the company's executive standards. Claire looked at her in front of the same committee that had once listened, while she dismissed Evan without hesitation. Were those the company's standards, Claire asked, or were they your own? Victoria had no answer. Claire placed the 2 files side by side on the table. Grant's polished credentials were on one side. Evan's proven results were on the other. Then Claire said that one man looked impressive on paper, while the other had actually made the system work. In the weeks that followed, Victoria lost her authority over executive hearing and was placed under a formal governance review. Eventually, she chose to step down from her position after it became clear that the board no longer trusted her judgment. There was no shouting during the final meeting. No dramatic confrontation. Only the heavy silence that settles over a room when everyone finally understands what happened and why it mattered. Grant, meanwhile, was not removed from Hawthorne Dynamics entirely. The review found no evidence that he had personally arranged or influenced the manipulation of the hearing scores. He remained within the strategy division, although in a much smaller role than the position he had originally been offered. To his credit, Grant approached Evan directly a few weeks later. Somewhat awkwardly, he admitted that the process had not been fair to either of them, although in very different ways. Evan appreciated the gesture more than he expected. Over time, the two men developed a working relationship that remained professional, even if they never became particularly close. It was built on a quiet mutual respect that came from surviving the same flawed system while standing on opposite sides of it. Eventually, Claire called Evan into her office. The moment closely mirrored the day, weeks earlier, when he had first walked into Hawthorne Dynamics believing his opportunity had already slipped away. This time, the chief executive was waiting for him. Claire offered him the position of Director of Strategic Operations, and she carefully explained exactly why. It was not because of the tire he had changed in the rain. It was not because he was raising his son alone. It was because he had noticed problems that others had ignored for months. Because he had never tried to use his connection with Claire to gain an advantage. Because he had remained composed while being underestimated in a room full of people who should have known better. And because, when his ideas were tested under real pressure, the results spoke for themselves. Evan took a moment before answering. Not because he doubted the offer, but because he wanted to say something honest rather than something that merely sounded thankful. He told Claire that he had spent 4 months walking into rooms where the gap in his employment and his responsibilities at home were treated as weaknesses before anyone bothered to ask what he was actually capable of doing. And this was the first time in a long while that he felt his work had been allowed to speak first. Claire nodded. "That is exactly the kind of company I'm trying to build," she said. "A company where results are not judged by who a person's family knows or how smoothly they can deliver a rehearsed answer." She added that his interview, as complicated as it had been, had ended up revealing the qualities that mattered most. Before accepting, Evan asked her one question. What would have happened if I had never stopped that morning? Claire considered it for a moment. "You probably would have arrived on time," she said. Then, after a brief pause, she added that she was not sure they would have ever truly understood who he was. In the months that followed, Evan settled into the rhythm of his new position. He learned the wider structure of the company beyond the single distribution center, where he had first proven his instincts were correct. But he kept the same habits that had brought him there. He arrived early whenever possible. He listened more than he spoke in meetings where he was still learning. And he treated every problem on the operations floor as something worth understanding firsthand, rather than managing entirely from a spreadsheet. His son remained mostly unaware of how close the opportunity had come to disappearing. He only noticed that his father seemed a little less exhausted in the evenings, and a little more willing to laugh at the same old jokes about baking soda volcanoes. Weeks later, Evan walked through the Hawthorne lobby on an ordinary morning. A young job candidate rushed through the doors, visibly nervous and apologizing to the front desk for arriving late. The receptionist began preparing to turn him away. Evan stopped. He asked the young man whether he had called ahead and explained the delay. When the answer was yes, Evan simply looked toward the receptionist. "Then we should hear him out before deciding who he is." He did not mention Claire. He did not give a long speech about second chances. He simply continued walking. But in his own quiet way, Evan had changed a small part of the very culture that had once looked at him with contempt. Evan Hale arrived late to the most important interview of his life. But sometimes what reveals whether a person deserves a seat at the table is not whether they walk into the room exactly on time. Sometimes it is whether they are willing to stop and help someone else when no one is watching.